Folks, in a never-ending quest to improve my social life, I was having dinner with a woman who wanted to discuss the chapter in my book, Progressive Faith and Practice, about evidence-based faith. She was increasingly frustrated with my refusal to believe things for which there is no scientific or objective evidence. Throwing her hands in the air, she exclaimed, "What you think you know is a fact is often completely proven wrong with the next discovery." Well, I was inclined to agree with that because that's how science works, that you think you know something, you find contrary evidence, and you change your opinion, unlike religion, which writes a creed that says you have to believe the same thing century after century and will kill you if you don't. So I was inclined to agree with her, but for some people, winning is not enough. She had to go on and say that there was an archaeologist in Bosnia that had discovered and unearthed pyramids covered in bronze that were older than the pyramids of Egypt in Giza. I was skeptical because I said a discovery of that magnitude would certainly have been broadly covered in the news and certainly would have come to my attention. She was exasperated, so she pulled out her phone to Google it, and we read together about a Bosnian businessman who claims that these hills are actually ancient man-made pyramids, but he hasn't unearthed anything. He is not an archaeologist. He is not a scientist. He is a tourist promoter who lives in Houston, Texas. Because I think in Texas, there might be people gullible enough to believe that those are pyramids. So we learned two things at that dinner. The first is that there are no ancient pyramids in Bosnia. And the second is that consistently being right does not make me more attractive to women. A newspaper column about a particularly stupid bank robber came to the attention of Cornell University psychologist David Dunning, and he launched a research project to try to understand why people with little or no information or comprehension are so confident that they are actually experts. And as you can see from this graph, what they discover is the less you know, the more confident you are of your opinions. And the more you learn, the more likely you are to have self-doubt until you actually gain some competence. Now, granted, the particular bank robber was an extreme case. He had learned that if you write in lemon juice, that the writing is invisible unless it's exposed to heat, like holding it over a candle. So he put two and two together and came up with 1111 and decided that if he put lemon juice on his face, that a bank's cameras would not be able to see him. Such that he was actually, this is a true story, he was actually shocked when he was arrested later the same day. And he said to police, "But I had lemon juice on my face." But what Dunning and Kruger discovered in their research is that there is an inverse relationship between how much a person knows and how confident they are about anything that they want to tell you. Literally, the less a person knows, the more self-assured they are that their beliefs are true, which explains why almost anyone who watches Fox News tries to tell you about what's actually happened in the world, that the least informed people are the most confident. Now, I've tended to think over the years that people are not simply gullible about these things, but they find it exciting to believe that there are pyramids in Bosnia that are older than the Egyptian pyramids. You might reasonably even conclude that a politician you don't like is so power hungry or suffers from entitlement issues that they are capable of committing horrible crimes. But to think that they are running a sex ring out of the back of a Washington pizza parlor, that requires a complete suspension of rational thought. But as Dunning pointed out in his study, if you are incompetent, you cannot know that you are incompetent. That's one of the reasons why you can't fix stupid, is that it requires a certain amount of intelligence to be able to be aware of how wrong you are. He continued, the skills you need to produce a right answer are exactly the skills you need to recognize what a right answer is. So if you can't know, you don't know. I always return to this observation of one of our nation's original philosophers, Thomas Paine, who said, to argue with a person who has renounced the use of reason is like administering medicine to the dead. This is why there's a fairly persuasive bit of political advice floating around these days that suggests that it is a total waste of time to try to get a Trump voter to change their vote for the 2020 election, because if they were capable of critical thinking, they wouldn't have voted for him in 2016. You cannot come to a right answer if you don't have the skills to know what a right answer is. It's much more effective to try to persuade one of the majority of American voters who just didn't vote to vote this year. You can see the largest block of voters in America are the people who just didn't vote. In the last election, just fewer than 20% voted for Clinton, less than 20% voted for Trump, but 50% more than either one of them just didn't vote. And of the ineligible to vote category, a lot of those are people who could become eligible to vote if they did something as complicated as register to vote. A Pew study conducted right after the 2016 election showed that what really elected Donald Trump was the inexplicably large number of people who just stayed home. This block of voters skews heavily towards younger voters and minorities who have the feeling that our political system simply offers them nothing, that there's no hope, that, as one comedian has said over the years, if voting could actually change anything, they wouldn't let us do it. It is overcoming that sense of cynicism, that sense of already having been defeated, that is our greatest obstacle in changing the world. But it's hard to convince people who will not listen. I'm a big fan of the New Yorker comedian Andy Borowitz, who writes satirical news items, but sometimes you just have to admit that his stuff is funny because it's true. He published this nugget a few years ago, but it keeps showing up on the internet because, in fact, the earth is endangered by a new strain of fact-resistant humans. There are people who, when presented with irrefutable facts, shrug their shoulders and will say something as complex as, "I don't believe that," as if that undoes reality. It's sort of like waiting for the coronavirus to show up, and all the people that are going to depend on essential oils are going to learn something about science. I'm always reticent to draw too many comparisons between the rise of Nazism in Germany and the rise of Trumpism in our age. Hitler was motivated by both a murderous racism and a psychopathic lust for power. Trump is motivated by racism, but it's more out of a pathetic inferiority complex. You know how KKK members are always the poorest white people with the lowest IQs. They have a need to feel superior to someone. And our president is so stupid that he desperately needs to feel superior to someone. And so Mexicans, immigrants, the poor, are his victims because he has no actual self-confidence. Trump is just pathetic. But in terms of the political dynamics, there are sufficient similarities between Trumpism and Nazism to talk about it. When the pastor and professor, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, finally decided that he had to set aside his pacifist views and become involved in a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, like pastors do when we run out of options. But we're not especially good at it. He got caught, he was imprisoned, and while he awaited execution, he was allowed to write letters. And I took one of them as our wisdom lesson today. Now, you may feel his pain and anguish as he's awaiting execution in Germany, as he dismisses his usual polite way of writing in favor of spelling out, in his case, that he was going to die because most of his neighbors and friends and associates and fellow pastors were pathetically stupid. That stupid people end up doing more damage in those dark days than did the genuinely evil people who were involved in the Nazi movement. He was so angry that his people, his countrymen, his people that he had gone to church with, the people he'd sat on pews with, were not waking up to the nightmare that was going on all around them. And we can all feel that, can't we? That we've all got neighbors and family members and friends who just don't seem to get it. And shouldn't they? Shouldn't it be obvious? He says, reasons fall on deaf ears. Facts that contradict one's prejudgment simply need not be believed. In such moments, the stupid person even becomes critical. Some of the dumbest people I have ever met in my life talk down to me as if copying an air of superiority suddenly awarded them a few Ivy League degrees. Even when facts are irrefutable, they are just pushed aside, Bonhoeffer says, as being inconsequential, as incidental. In all this, the stupid person, in contrast to the malicious one, is utterly self-satisfied, and being easily irritated becomes dangerous by going on attack. The people who send me death threats, the people who have mailed cut-up dead animals to me, the people who've thrown a concrete block through the windshield of my car, they're not doing that because my arguments are wrong. They're doing it because my arguments are right. And they can't refute them rationally, so they try to attack me personally. And that's why I don't get scared of them. If they're that stupid, they couldn't possibly accomplish killing me, no matter how much they try. We can all recognize this phenomenon, and most of us have to experience it at Thanksgiving table. Though it isn't simply that people are misinformed by Fox News or even Russian bots planting conspiracy theories on social media sites, because there is something of the chicken or the egg paradox involved. Sure, in part, Fox feeds propaganda to simple-minded people, and they believe it, and they repeat it, but there's also the fact that the simple will choose to expose themselves to Fox News because they already like believing paranoid conspiracy theories. They already choose to believe ignorant things, and they are seeking confirmation of bias. But when you use a word like evil, which Bonhoeffer does, then you're dragging a political debate into the church. If you use a theological term like that, then it becomes something to do with religious conversation, of spiritual discernment, and of ethical deliberation. Because as difficult as it is to accept that there are people who are stupid because they are simply lacking mental faculty, but here's the really painful thing. There are people who are stupid because they have chosen stupidity. That is their preference. In fact, the famous psychiatrist M. Scott Peck, who almost disturbingly looks like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, doesn't he? He literally turned the equation around, and Peck defined evil as being a kind of militant ignorance. That is, that a person chooses to deny facts, to ignore information, to refuse to accept evidence even when unavoidably presented. People don't want to change the way they live or the way they make money, and so they simply will deny climate science. They will commit what I will be talking about in a few weeks, a kind of application bias fallacy. That is, you can tell a woman that if a woman buys a gun, she increases her chances of being killed with a gun by 17 times. Those are the stats. That's information that's been kept officially by scientists who follow the Center for Disease Control, how people die. Women who get frightened by a gun for self-protection actually increase their chances of being murdered by 1,700%. That is not a small number, but it is just math. And yet I've had people insist to my face, that doesn't apply to me. What universe do you have to live in where math doesn't work? How can you just choose to say math doesn't apply to me? Try that with your bank. It is a fact, it's math, but they refuse to apply that fact to their own circumstances. It is called an application bias. They don't apply it to themselves because they don't want it to be true. So in their universe, they tell themselves it's not true. Meteorologist and climate activist Paul Douglas has been trying to educate people about the changes in the climate that are directly related to our use of fossil fuels because of the transportation choices that we make. We drive around in gas-burning SUVs instead of riding in subways and electric trains. But at every turn, you run into people in the oil and coal industry who immediately label you as simply being a liberal. And you hear the word socialist. Almost every time you hear a commentator on TV say the word socialist, what they are telling you secretly is, I couldn't possibly have passed a middle school civics class because I'm too stupid to know what socialism is. They use the word liberal and socialist to dismiss things that are too complicated for their feeble minds to understand. I would say this less politely, but I can't figure out how. But as Douglas says, being open to facts doesn't make you a liberal, it makes you literate. But we are now in possession of a post-fact society, a fact-resistant population that swears that something is not true for no other reason than that they do not want it to be true. I have wondered a lot in recent months, how do we just go on day after day being at least subliminally aware that there are tens of thousands of kids in cages, in detention centers, mostly along our southern border, but some of them have been transferred north. Last year, there were 70,000 children. 70,000 children who were traumatized for several months out of the year, some more than a year, held in unsanitary cages in unsafe circumstances, many of whom were sick, some of whom were hungry, and not a few were being sexually molested. How do we go to sleep at night and wake up in the morning in the wealthiest democracy in the history of the world, treating children like this by the tens of thousands? And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of immolations. And I apologize, it's strong. And if you don't want to look at it, don't look at the screen. But I remember in 1963 when a Buddhist monk set himself on fire in Vietnam to draw attention to the immorality of the war in Vietnam. 10 years later, that war was over. And I don't know that there was a direct one-to-one relationship, but I was a child when this image was shown on TV, and it changed how I felt about the Vietnamese War. And I think it changed the way people thought in Vietnam, and I think it changed the way people thought in the United States. In 2010, very recent memory for us, a college-educated man in Tunisia, Mohamed Bouzizi, couldn't get a job. In desperation, he was selling vegetables on a cart in the public streets to try to raise enough money to care for his family. But government corruption was such that they were taking what little money that he was able to raise. And to draw attention to government corruption, he set himself on fire and unfortunately survived the initial flame and died in anguish over the next year. But Muhammad was credited with starting the Arab Spring that brought about much needed transformation in Tunisia and in much of the Arab world. So I apologize for planting this image in your mind, but I just think it has to be said. I have wondered over the past few months, and I'm not threatening to set myself on fire, I'm not threatening to martyr myself, but I have wondered if I drove down to one of these detention centers in Texas and Florida and set myself on fire, I have wondered if anybody would notice. Has our nation become so jaded, so morally indifferent, so willing to go to bed and rise up the next day and not give a damn that you could literally set yourself on fire and it would not matter? Now, I would, being completely serious, I would gladly sacrifice my life if it would reunite these children with their parents. And I strongly suspect that I'm not even alone in this room. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I know that among people of conscience, the value of our own life is infinitesimally small compared to this child abuse going on in the lives of tens of thousands of children every day on our behalf with our tax dollars. How can we not stop it? But an immolation wouldn't do it right now, folks. I'm confident of that because we don't have the moral character of Vietnam in the 1960s. We don't have the moral character of Tunisia of 2010. So what would awaken conscience in Trump's America? I'm pretty sure that martyrdom wouldn't do it. I return again and again to the insight of the French philosopher Voltaire, who said that those who can make you believe in absurdities can make you commit atrocities. I think that the dumbing down of both religion and politics in America has made our population such that we will let them do anything. And even when we know about it, we don't do anything about it. We are traumatizing, torturing, dehumanizing, and sexually molesting tens of thousands of children every day as a part of our government policy, and somehow Republicans and Democrats and independents go along with it. This much I know. We have one chance to usher in a peaceful revolution. And as John Kennedy said, those who prevent peaceful revolution make violent revolution necessary. But we have one chance this year, in November, to have a peaceful revolution by going to the ballot box. As Bonhoeffer said, he would never again try to persuade the stupid person with reasons, for it is senseless and it is dangerous. It is dangerous for us to assume that we could turn Trump voters into intelligent people. It cannot be done. So we will not save the soul of our once great nation by arguing with Trump supporters. We have one chance, and that is to outnumber them. There can be no excuse for not voting this year. Anyone 18 years old or older, you have no excuse to not vote. There is no excuse for leaving social change up to martyrs and revolutionaries when it lies within your hands simply to overcome your cynicism, your depression, your skepticism, your disappointment, and go vote. Vote for a restoration of sanity in America. Now, I would be willing to die for the restoration of these children to their families, but my death would not faze Donald Trump unless it simply pleased him. The only thing that will change this is for you, all of our listeners, every single one of you, to vote this year.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.